having to sell your child just so you can save the rest of your family from starvation. But that's exactly what is happening in Afghanistan, where more and more families are having to make this impossible choice. Since the Taliban takeover, international aid has dried up and millions of people are facing acute malnutrition. It's increasingly common for families to sell off girls as young as 8 or 9 years old to older men in exchange for food. Such is the case of 9-year-old Parwana, who made international headlines when she was sold to a 55-year-old man. Her sobbing father said he had no choice if he was to save her brothers and sisters. Well, Heather Barr is the Associate Director of the Women's Rights Division for Human Rights Watch, and she joins us now from Islamabad in Pakistan. Thank you very much for being with us. And firstly, is there any idea, any estimate of how many young girls there are like Parwana?
No, it's impossible to know. There's no data on that. There's very little data on many things in Afghanistan. But there is some data from the United Nations saying that by next summer, 97% of all Afghans may be below the poverty line. So the situation could not be more dire. And these reports about girls being sold have been coming out more and more frequently in recent weeks. And I'm afraid we're going to see much more of this as winter comes in Afghanistan.
Because there is a culture, isn't there, of young girls being married off quite young in Afghanistan, although it is illegal for girls under 15, or it was illegal for girls under 15 to be married. But it's become more common, hasn't it, since the Taliban took power?
Well, child marriage is a problem all around the world, and Afghanistan is certainly one of the countries where, child marriage was a big problem 3 months ago before the return of the Taliban, for sure. But, we know from research on child marriage all around the world that there are some risk factors that always come up. And one of them is extreme poverty. Families find themselves in a situation where even if they're not potentially going to get money for their daughter, they're going to be better able to feed their family members by reducing their family size. And so we see that extreme poverty is a driver of child marriage. And another major factor in driving child marriage is girls not having access to education. And as you probably know, on September 18th, the Taliban reopened secondary schools, but only for boys. And so the vast majority of girls' secondary schools from about grade 7 on up have remained closed across the country for, I think now is the 48th day.
So when the girls are at home, they're more at risk of being sold off like this?
Exactly. As long as a girl's in school, her family is invested in her education, and the two things are often seen as mutually exclusive. If you're in school, you wouldn't get married, and if you're married, you wouldn't go to school. And so the situation that's happened in Afghanistan right now is that you have this huge and growing number of families that simply can't feed themselves at the same time that all of this investment that's been put into educating girls has come to a screeching halt.
It's really hard to think about, but do we know what happens to these young girls when they are sold off to older men?
No, we don't know. And I'm sure that, there are discussions that happen between the girls' parents and the person or the family that's buying them, and there are assurances made that the girls will be treated well and protected and looked after, but there's no way at all to know whether those promises are kept.
Are you frustrated by the fact that Afghanistan has kind of fallen out of the headlines in recent weeks? Do you feel that the world has turned its back on the civilians in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think devastated might be a better word than frustrated. I think, this crisis that's happening in Afghanistan, which looks set to become a famine, is not the result of a natural disaster. It's the result of actions by the international community. It's the result of the fact that the Taliban regained power, and the international community that was funding 75% of the government's budget pulled the plug on all of that funding overnight. And the consequence is that it's not the Taliban who are being harmed. It's girls like Parwana. And the international community in the 2.5 months since that happened doesn't seem to have done much to try and address the situation, doesn't seem to have felt much of a sense of responsibility to the Afghan people who are the ones who are being hurt by this. And, we've been extremely critical of the Taliban's record on women's rights. We've put something out this morning talking about how the Taliban themselves are blocking women aid workers from being able to do their job, and that's part of what's making it harder to reach women-headed households. So this is not to be an apologist for the Taliban at all, and we want to see donors use their leverage over the Taliban to press for respect for women's rights, but that can't come at the cost of women's lives.
What would you say to people who are watching this at home, who are horrified by this? What can they do to help?
Well, there are many organizations that are managing to deliver food and other essentials to people on the ground, so people can give money. That's always useful. People can pressure governments wherever they are to speak up, to be more involved, to raise these issues through the UN, through bilateral discussions between different countries. This is a shocking crisis, because I know that there are crises in many countries around the world, but this one is particularly created by the international community, because there's no country that has been sort of externally managed for the last 20 years in the way that Afghanistan has been, and it's pretty shocking that within weeks of the foreign troops leaving after 20 years of presence, there could be this kind of a catastrophe, and everyone could be sort of shrugging and walking away.
Heather Barr at Human Rights Watch, thank you very much.
Thank you.